Hello and welcome back to the Humanities and Social Sciences teach-in around the assault on the nation's capital in January. I'd like for us to start our 12:30 panel. That will be Dr. David Borkowski from the English department and Dr. Dua McLeod from the history department. There were some technical issues, but I think we're all straightened out now. All right, and Dr. McLeod will be going up first, I think.
Yes, hi.
All right.
Thank you, Ian. And thank you for putting this together, and thanks all for coming and participating. It's funny, just staring at a screen, and I've been doing this 20 years, I still get nervous, even though there's no humans in my room except me. But really happy to be here and to have overcome the technical difficulties. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to go through a brief presentation. I'm going to really try to keep it short. I might even be a little quick because I want to leave time for Professor Borkowski, but also discussion. I think a lot of this stuff will come out with questions people have. So let me get started on the presentation itself. So I've been paying attention to the Republican Party since Watergate was my introduction to politics as a 10-year-old. So it's something I've been paying attention to for a long time, and as an American historian studying. So I want to just start with reminding us what we all know, but reminding us how we got here, right? Why we're doing this teach-in here today, right? These events of January 16th January 6th. Were truly extraordinary in American history, truly remarkable, and if I can editorialize, truly odious and dangerous. I'm sure I could come up with better words as well. And, we could talk about what we call it, and I don't want to get bogged down in that, but I think it's important to, that is an interesting question, and it's important to maybe nail it down, but I think it's still developing. Our knowledge of it is still developing. We don't really know. But this wasn't, I don't want to minimize is really what's really important. So I just picked this New York Times article somewhat at random, but they did a deep dive for what we know so far. And they use words like subvert the election and then overturn the election. And I just point this out, not to pick on the New York Times, but I'm not satisfied with either of those words, right? I think we need something real, those are so, sort of basic and they don't have a lot of bite to them. Oh, subvert and overturn, that's not good, but there's something different here. So whether it's called a coup or whatever it is, I think we can talk about that in the discussion. And so, as I say, I really don't want to minimize what's happened there. So how do we explain these events? Well, it's obviously Trump. Trump is a singular figure in American history, and we can talk more about him, but I'm really not going to talk about Trump. I think there's a lot about Trump that's obviously responsible for this, and there's a lot to talk about, obviously. But I want to talk about how Trump emerges from the history of the Republican Party, specifically in the last 50 years. It's not the only possible way that the Republican Party would have turned, but it is, Trump is a natural outgrowth of some of the aspects of the Republican Party that we've seen over the last 50 years. Similarly, right-wing extremism has been here all along, and there's things about that aren't aligned with the Republican Party, but that are really aligned with these events. And similarly, the right-wing media environment, something I won't get into today, but is another, Professor Borkowski, I think will help us understand some of that. And I think we'll probably end up talking during the discussion about some of that. All I want to really focus on, again, is the Republican Party and how they, as well as, the right-wing extremists, as well as Trump, as well as right-wing media, fomented, fostered, spread what I am calling lies about voter fraud and a stolen election. And as I say, if you still believe those lies, you're not going to be happy today. And this is a real difficult problem. Again, something that we can discuss more in this. But, this to me, there's not sort of different interpretations, right? So again, I want to emphasize the Republican Party's role and just really focusing on a couple places where it becomes clear that this is not just Trump. Like if you look at the story of Trump, there's a lot of wild and crazy stuff going on and conspiracy theories and crazy people coming into the White House. All of this stuff is important, but it's not just those people. On December 7th, 18 Republican attorneys general tried to overthrow the election results, only in 4 states, right? Only the 4 states that Trump needed. And 126 Republicans from the House signed on to this. The Supreme Court instantly dismissed it. This was not just a case of, well, we're playing out all sort of, paths, and, the legal process is part of it, and that's okay, and let's let it play out. No, this was, a radical and extreme measure. Similarly, on January 6th, as we know, even after the attack on the Capitol, more than half of the Republicans in the House voted not to accept the will of the voters. That, again, truly radical, extreme, undemocratic actions. That's deeply embedded in the Republican Party. There may be some very nice Republicans. I actually even know some very nice fascists, It has nothing to do with their personalities and the nice things they may or may not say. It has to do with the structural power of the Republican Party, both within the party itself and then its outsized role as a minority party in American politics. So longer term history very quickly, right? The Republican Party was founded in 1854 in opposition to the Southern slaveholders' anti-democratic stranglehold on power in the national government, in opposition to the spread of slavery, right? Nominated Lincoln for presidency in 1860, generally considered our greatest, or one of at least the top 3 of our presidents. His election triggered the secession of the anti-democratic politicians of the South, leading to the Civil War. After the Civil War, the good guys win, and or so we think, and the Republicans lead the passage of 3 key amendments guaranteeing the citizenship and the right to vote for all Americans, including African Americans. We spend, by the way, the next 100 years in this country still fighting over the fulfillment of those amendments, and we'll come back to that. The Republicans were not necessarily leaders in civil rights. Neither political party was, but the hardcore resistance to equality and democracy sat with the Southern leadership of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party was a sort of split between the Southern white supremacist leadership, that was reinstalling a kind of apartheid regime in the South, and the Northern urban working class. So it's a weird kind of mixture, but that was the politics till the middle of the 20th century. It starts to change as the Northern Democrats start to push more for civil rights because of the activism of African Americans and their allies throughout the 20th century. We start to see some movement in the 30s, especially in the 40s, during the Second World War and immediately afterwards, coming to the party starts to split in 1948, and then with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we finally have those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments fulfilled in reality in American life, and the Southern Democrats left the party over the next few years. And they joined the Republican Party, and the Republican Party welcomed them. And so, as I say here, they didn't necessarily embrace the explicit racism of the Southern leaders that had been the bulwark of the anti-civil rights power structure in the South, but they absolutely brought into the party those disaffected white voters who did not support civil rights. And it turns out did not go to sleep, did not quit just because these laws were passed. We often thought, some of us, right, finally, we talk about progress in American history. Finally, we've seen these things fulfilled. In fact, we have not. So Republicans shifted. They pursue what's called the Southern strategy in pursuit of these Southern whites over the next couple decades. There's a famous quote that I won't put from Lee Atwater, the Republican political strategist. You can find it yourself. And he literally starts saying, y'all don't quote me on this. And then gives us the quote about how we move from explicit racism towards symbolic issues, divisive issues, busing, states' rights, affirmative action, and then even to just buzzwords and things like welfare, things like law and order, which aren't the war on drugs. These things aren't explicitly racial, but their target audiences understand that these are racially targeted, right? Law and order doesn't mean law and order. Law and order means something very historically specific that's targeting African Americans, the war on drugs as well. So that's one shift in the Republican Party that's happening in the 80s and is very, very clear by the 1980s. Again, I'm not saying it's the whole story of the Republican parties, but it's absolutely a central story of the Republican Party at this time. In the 90s, Newt Gingrich, who has been called the man who broke politics, weaponizes this sort of, he recognizes politically that the key is not to lure people to your side. The key is to get people on your side really worked up, to turn them into seeing politics as something much more than just, well, we disagree about, tax rates and infrastructure and tariffs and these sorts of things. But in fact, our opponents are the enemies of the people, are trying to destroy us. They are vile, they are vermin, these kinds of issues. We must oppose everything about them. And Mitch McConnell brings that in during the Obama administration. The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. Republicans across the board in politics and in media let that out, right? If we give Obama a victory, it will help him get reelected. Therefore, we will not sign on to anything he wants. And so that was the political strategy, for good or for ill, right? What it means, however, is that the Republicans, well, let's look at some of the structural, and I'll just really breeze through these. But there's so many structural obstacles to democracy that are built for a reason. Electoral college, there's a reason we don't have a popular vote. That's got its own history. The founders didn't want the people to directly decide. There's a reason we have a Senate. The founders didn't want the people to directly decide, right? As it stands right now, the Democrats have 50 senators aligned with them. They represent 42 million more voters than the 50 Republican senators. Gerrymandering, the changing of congressional districts, disenfranchisement. Why do we have places like District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that are citizens but don't actually get to vote for the presidency? Voter suppression. After the passage of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Republican Party started slowly but relentlessly to undermine that law. And it has been thoroughly undermined. The Supreme Court finally said a couple of years ago, we don't, everything's fine. We don't need to have that law anymore. We don't need to enforce that law anymore. And so different ways of disenfranchising voters in general, Black voters in particular. And the myth of voter fraud is one of those. Voter fraud sounds, oh yeah, I bet it must happen. It must happen. It doesn't happen. 0.001% individual cases, maybe here and there. There's no such thing as voter fraud as a major problem in this country, or even a minor problem. But the myth of that allows states to restrict the franchise. Felons, things like this. So this is just a sampling of, articles that I linked to that, and I'm going to close with this, right? Just since the inauguration, Republicans trying to make it harder to vote. They understand that's the solution. We are a minority party. We must get fewer people to vote. And there's ample evidence of this, and they're very straightforward about it. Over 106 bills designed to restrict voting access have been introduced or continued since the election. Gerrymandering is in control of Republicans. A lot of states, they're going to redistrict to ensure they win. The filibuster is again, not part of the Constitution, but a way that the Republicans keep undue power, even though they are the minority party. Look, and you can say these are good things if you want, right? That's debatable. But my point is that the Republicans understand at this point in history, they have two choices. Either come up with policies and appeals that appeal to more people, or restrict the number of people voting. They have chosen restrict the number of people voting, right? And they have done so often through racial lines, because an essential part of their the voters respond to the appeal to white supremacy. White supremacy isn't the only thing going on with something like QAnon and all of these different conspiracies, but it's the linchpin that holds a lot of it together, right? And it leads to violence, as what we've seen. And that violence is now an acceptable part of the Republican Party policy for restoring the election. Just to finish, right? They showed up on January 6th because they were told their election had been stolen from them. That makes sense. You should fight, right? You should get your guns out if your country is being stolen from you. We've all been taught that. That's what the Patriots did. That's how we have a country, right? So it's that lie that's still at the center of the Republican Party, and that uses violence. I think is something that we still need to contend with and come up with a solution to. So I'm going to leave it off there and pass it over to my friend David Borkowski, and then we'll come back for discussion and questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So we just heard how Lee Atwater, the Republican strategist, was using various buzzwords to try and appeal to disaffected white voters. And the party, in order to change itself, it needed to change its language. So, excuse me, most of you know that I'm sure that the title of my presentation, Big Brother Isn't Watching Us, but We're Watching Big Brother, is a modification of Orwell's slogan from his novel 1984. While I was looking at photos and videos of the January 6 rioters, it reminded me of what I saw years ago when I first turned that Orwellian phrase on its head. It had come to me back then. And that was during the 2007 American League Baseball Championship Series between the Cleveland Indians and the Boston Red Sox. It was Game 7. The winner goes to the World Series. If you don't know how a baseball game is televised, there's a camera in center field, and the camera captures the back of the pitcher hurling the baseball at the batter. At times, the camera will bypass the pitcher, and we see simply the batter in the batter's box. So as I'm watching the game, I'm becoming increasingly distracted and even a little disorientated by something I'm seeing to my left behind the batter, which the camera is picking up. There is a couple in their 30s, about their 30s, early 40s, and they're sitting in what are arguably the best seats in the house. That is, they're sitting behind the batter's box. But they're not watching the game. They're mostly looking below at themselves at something between their laps. They're pointing to it and they're laughing and they're talking to each other, and then occasionally they're picking their heads up. And it occurred to me that what they were doing was essentially not watching themselves, not watching the game. I'm sorry, let me repeat that. What they were doing was watching themselves, not watch the game, the real game. So they were looking at their device, at themselves, not watching the game, the very game that they were in the present watching. which was a rather odd thing. It's sort of, it's like this existential moment. So, there they were inside their devices, the very devices that the rioters had taken with them to the Capitol. One of the things that I noticed about the photos and the videos of the January 6 rioters revealed that many of them were watching themselves on their smartphones storming the Capitol. They were there, but not really there, just like that couple. It was sort of a techno outer body experience. They were looking at their existence inside their screens from the outside, looking in at the images. So there they were inside the very devices, the very discursive platforms or vehicles really, where they had immersed themselves before, having become absorbed by, in the sounds and visions, words and images of the misogynistic, militaristic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Antifa, racist, lock her up, 9/11 was a hoax, build the wall, stop the steal, make America great again, the devices and the discourses that were available to them. When President Biden was inaugurated, he said at his inauguration, "We must reject a culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured," end quote. But that cat was let out of the proverbial bag a long time ago, especially the past 100 years. Interestingly, Biden's words echo two profoundly significant articles by Edward Bernays, the father of spin. The first is titled "Manipulating Public Opinion," which appeared in 1928 in the American Journal of Sociology, and the second, "The Engineering of Consent," which appeared in 1947 in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. It's in the 1947 article where Bernays rather casually spells out how he came to recognize how easy it was to manipulate public opinion and engineer, rather than Biden's manufacture, consent. This revelation or epiphany occurred as a matter of life and death. After being a hawker for the Ballet Russe and stirring up the Enrico Caruso craze for American audiences, Bernays landed a job in 1917 alongside the head of the Foreign Press Bureau of the U.S. Committee on Public Information. Bernays helps win over an American population to an unpopular war. And here's what he wrote in that piece. And I just have to find it. Okay. Give me a second. So this is from the Engineering of Consent. During World War I, the famous Committee on Public Information, organized by George Creel, dramatized in the public's consciousness the effectiveness of the war of words. The committee helped to build the morale of our own people to win over the neutrals and to disrupt the enemy. It helped to win that war. The effectiveness of the words. I'd like to remind everyone the number of times commentators would talk about, in the aftermath of January 6th, the significance and importance of Trump's words. They mattered, right? Bernays goes on, same article. During World War I and the immediate post-war years, a new profession developed in response to the demand for trained, skilled specialists to advise others on the technique of engineering public consent, a profession providing counsel on public relations. So the essential lesson then Bernays learns is the following. If you can convince people, a mass amount of people, against their better judgment, to get them to sail overseas, kill complete strangers, and possibly be killed by them, then how hard can it be to engineer and sway the same masses to buy a bunch of stuff they don't need or don't think they need? Unless, of course, you get inside their heads and persuade them otherwise. Why, it's positively un-American not to do so. At the beginning of the same article, The Engineering of Consent, Bernays starts off with the following. Freedom of speech and its democratic corollary, a free press, have tacitly expanded our Bill of Rights to include the right of persuasion. He goes on, the tremendous expansion of communications in the United States has given the nation the world's most penetrating and effective apparatus for the transmission of ideas. Every resident is constantly exposed to the impact of our vast network of communications, which reach every corner of the country, no matter how remote or isolated. Words hammer continually at the eyes and ears of America. The United States has become a small room in which a single whisper is magnified thousands of times. Later, Bernays reiterates the, quote, blueprint of actions he provided in the 1928 article outlining the ways and the how of engineering consent. One must discern, quote, the subconscious and conscious motivations in public thought and actions, words and pictures that affect these motivations. One must, quote, plan for mass persuasion. Then the engineer of mass consent must create news, end quote. As a result, quote, events may also be set up in chain reaction, end quote. Finally, words, sounds, and pictures accomplish little unless they are tools of a soundly thought out plan and carefully organized methods. So you know who recognized that his country lost the propaganda war in World War I? Well, it just so happens to be this guy. By the way, that is the extent of my PowerPoint portion of the program here. So in Mein Kampf, Hitler states just that the Germany lost the propaganda war, that if only Germany had been able to convince Americans to fight on its side, then Germany probably would have won the war. But not again. In 1933, Bernays learns that Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels was using Bernays' methods to tout Hitler and Nazi genius while scapegoating Jews, Poles, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other vermin. Goebbels had picked up on Bernays' insistence that for mass consent to work, repetition is needed, especially if it comes from different sources. Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders, don't upset us. Stop the steal, must see TV. Saddam Hussein is harboring terrorists and has weapons of mass destruction. Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce. Special orders, don't upset us. Saddam Hussein is harboring terrorists and has weapons of mass destruction. Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce. Special marching orders won't upset us. Granted, Bernays argues in the 1928 Manipulating Public Opinion article that it can be done for good and not necessarily for evil, such as, quote, bringing about a change or at least a modification for the better in the public attitude toward the Negro, question mark, end quote. Nevertheless, Bernays' mother was Sigmund Freud's sister, and his father's sister was Freud's wife. We have to assume Bernays was well aware of the study of the mind, its conscious, unconscious, and semi-conscious states. Likely, too, he was aware of the work of Freud's disciple Carl Jung and his study of man and his symbols and the archetypes of our collective unconscious, and how Jung believed that psychic truths can be even more powerful than physical truths, such as the example Jung gives in his 1952 short work, Answer to Job, that the psychic truth that Christ was born the son of a virgin was even more powerful than the fact that there's no physical proof that that's at all possible. Earlier in 1907, Henry Adams identifies the dynamics of such psychic truths in a chapter titled The Dynamo and the Virgin in his The Education of Henry Adams, wherein he claims how the grand churches and cathedrals built by hand during the Middle Ages were done so by such powerful beliefs, rivaling early 20th century machines. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan, who has all the best lines, by the way, he's got the best line. Satan tells us that the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of a hell and a hell of a heaven. In the beginning was the Word. God had to say, let there be light, before there was any. Creation and later destruction begin with the Word. You know that iconic American breakfast of bacon and eggs? That was Bernays. Getting women to take up smoking, especially the most popular brand, Lucky Strikes, that was Bernays. Repackaging and rebranding the impersonal and about as dull as a bag of sand, but highly regarded technocrat presidential candidate Calvin Coolidge? That was Bernays. Before the 1920s, the United States had more railroad track laid and operational than every other nation on the planet combined. Now the US has less than Brazil. While Firestone Tires, General Motors, and Standard Oil did collude to form a dummy corporation to bankrupt the railroad industry, Bernays had a very big hand in that one too, in getting Americans to drive more, create a car culture, and therefore use and need less public transportation. Mind you, we've been fearful of the psychic truthfulness or truthiness of the word for a very long time, for better and for worse, in censoring it or redirecting it. It's why Oliver Cromwell's Puritan administration, after deposing the monarchy, along with deposing Charles I's head, closed down theaters. All those violent and naughty dramas and satires of Shakespeare's and other Elizabethans, Shakespeare's plays and other Elizabethans was too corrupting. Let's not forget Matthew Arnold's program of educating properly a growing bourgeoisie who were losing religious faith and therefore needed to read Shelley's nature poems, but God forbid should they read the radical ones that were later favored by socialists and laborers. Flaubert's Emma Bovary does, after all, feel even worse about her boring, dull life after reading the chivalric romances of Sir Walter Scott. No less, according to Mark Twain, the damage done to Southern American slaveholders who read Scott. But such concerns about the potential evils and sinister effects of manipulating public opinion date all the way back to the ancient Greeks. In Plato's Gorgias, Gorgias being the name of the real-life most renowned rhetorician at that time. In it, Socrates is appalled that Gorgias brags about how, as a masterful persuader, he can convince a sickly patient to take his medicine better than the patient's doctor. But here's the thing. And I need to find something. Oh, here we go. Okay, excuse me. So here's the thing, though. The ancients weren't listening to orations every day of the week. Elizabethans weren't watching stagings of dramas and comedies each day for hours. The Victorians weren't reading novels and newspapers morning, noon, and night. In the 30s, Americans weren't waking up in the morning and turning on their radios to find President Roosevelt had issued yet another series of baffling, fiery fireside chats. Meanwhile, starting during the same period, moviegoers weren't going to the movies each and every day and watching movies hours on end. And even at the height of American TV viewership, when the average American watched 5 to 8 hours of programming, they still weren't carrying around their TV sets on the streets, taking them to work, to school, in their cars, waiting online with them while they were picking up groceries. The iPhone first came out on June 29th, 2007. Remember that couple I mentioned at the baseball playoff game, absorbed with themselves inside their phone? That was almost 4 months later to the day. That seventh game was on October 21st, 2007. So it only took 4 months for us to fall into the rabbit hole filled with, in some cases, dodos, mock turtles, and mad hatters. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Borkowski. And Duer and David, we are open for questions, so please stand by, and Jim, if there are questions, please post them.
Of course, and just a reminder to everybody, you can send questions to myself or Tia. Also, if you want to speak directly to our presenters, feel free to raise your hand and we will bring you into the conversation. And by raise your hand, I mean the raise your hand icon that puts you at the top, not just raise your hand. We can't see all 100 and some odd participants at the same time. Okay, we're going to bring Roy D'Angelo in here. Roy, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. And it was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. I guess I have one question. Since you were talking about truth, I was wondering, is there a relationship between the growth of postmodern thought and the undermining of truth? And does the academy bear some responsibility for the right wing's utilization of relativism?
I'll answer that. Or first, do you mind?
No, go right ahead.
Great. No, that's a great big question. I'm going to give a somewhat big answer. I'll try not to go too long. I mean, I think what David's presentation really shows is it's really modernism starts to make this, right? The early 20th century, we're already seeing the manipulation of truth, right? And the need for there to be a mass support of government policies. And so, my old professor, Stuart Ewan, who's written about Bernays and others, called World War I the first great PR event, right? Every country had their major propaganda campaigns. And, the US was particularly tricky because Wilson had run in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And then he had to turn around and get American popular opinion to support the war. But I'd also say, I always want to push back against this manipulation because there's this thing called reality. We may disagree with it, but I still believe in it. Maybe I misperceive it. I don't want to get into all the philosophical, but when David talked about Hitler's interpretation of the First World War, he was just wrong, right? Germany didn't lose the PR battle, right? It had a little, US coming in on the side of the British had a little something to do with, the Germans, torpedoing passenger boats and conspiring with Mexico to try to invade the US. And, there were policy issues, right or wrong, that the US also paid attention to. It wasn't just about, and the propaganda really only kicked off after, or in the time of the decision to make to enter the war. And then it kicked off and there was, stories made up wholesale. So that's so we're seeing Bernays talk about this, and you mentioned Henry Adams and all of this. This stuff has been, people are talking about this from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. I do think, postmodernism in some ways is just hyped up modernism. I'm not convinced it's totally different, but I'm not convinced that it doesn't. And I think you're right. Like academic ideas like post-structuralism are fascinating and embracing of relativism. And I actually think the right wing have become the great relativists, the great believers that there is no truth, there is no absolute reality, right? Famously during the Bush administration, Karl Rove, it's believed it was him, told the journalist, you people in the reality-based community are going to, you can keep trying to talk about this stuff. We're going to create reality. And again, they had a great propaganda campaign, which sold us lies to sell us a war in Iraq. But reality still is there. And we lost the war in Iraq, right? Because reality was there. You can't just keep creating reality. So finally, I think what's really different from what you get us to is like in the 21st century, this engineering consent is such a different, there's no central power source that can just tell us what to believe and we like zombies will follow, if ever there was, right? It's much more complex and it's therefore much more difficult. Someone direct messaged me saying, well, if this voter fraud thing is out there, how do we continue to ensure this myth doesn't spread, right? That's a real challenge. And I'm not sure that people like Orwell and Bernays and all of that provide us with guidance. I find it really challenging. I knew we would end up talking about this. How do you compete with Fox News, but also, all of the manipulation of Twitter and Facebook and all of this. It's not the mind that we talk, Bernays was talking about and Walter Lippmann and others. It's actually the heart, the gut, the loins. All of these things are much more powerful. And how do we, as academics, we love rational discourse. How do we have that when that's not really what's driving? So that's my short/long answer to that.
Yeah, I would just add, Rory, you had asked whether or not the Academy bears any responsibility. I kind of have mixed feelings about it, quite honestly. On the one hand, I would say so. I mean, we're a very large institution, not just William Patterson University, but obviously universities and colleges across the United States. And so on the one hand, while we are trying to educate people and to have people view the world with an open mind, maybe in some ways we could be doing a better job. So.
Just jumping on that, I agree. I hear, it's easy to pick on post-structuralists and postmodern thinking. But I also believe that we are in, the public arena is one of contestation of ideas. And that's what I teach. There's no universal truth of American history. There are facts that are undisputed, but which ones are more important, how we understand them, that's what we're engaged in. And people who disagree with me, who want to say, no, these are the facts. I mean, the Trump administration at the very end came out with something called the 1776 Commission. And, it tries to say in the good old days, before all these lefty academics started revising history, we knew the eternal truths. And their eternal truths were fairy tales, fantasies, some facts, a lot of plagiarism as well. I mean, just really simple-minded stuff that is just not, I don't think we need to defend the idea that we need to push back against that, right? The claim that relativism and presentism are the fault of academics when everybody who says anything about the past is engaging from their own perspective. And again, it doesn't mean you can say, like when I said the Civil War, the good guys won, you can disagree. That's an opinion. That's a judgment, right? The fact of the Civil War happening, not an opinion.
Thank you, Rory. Okay, up next, our next question is from Christopher Ward. Can you talk briefly about how culture, specifically Christian fundamentalism, and TV shows like 24 and Homeland contribute to or inform the radicalization of the right?
I'll always jump in. You want to go first this time, though, David?
Well, yeah, you might as well, because I guess I should, full disclosure, I don't own a TV. So I think I've seen one episode, maybe two, of Homeland. What was the other show?
24.
I haven't seen that one at all. So go ahead.
We know your pop culture references were from the 1970s. We got it, David.
1970s? Are you kidding? How about the 1870s?
Right, exactly. Matthew Arnold, right?
Yeah.
So I can speak to a bit of that. I actually think that's really, the Christian nationalism is really central. And I've been reading more about that lately, that, some were calling this insurrection was a Christian nationalist insurrection, invasion. And I'm not, certain about that, but I think it's real important. I also think just the sort of general militarization of our pop culture has been long standing. And I was watching, I love old movies, but there's no such thing as an anti-war war movie in a sense, right? And I used to watch 24 when it came out, and they had the good guys doing evil things, and if the show's well made, you're cheering for the good guys to do evil things to the bad guys, because that's what you want. So the structure of these movies, rather than looking at whether they're truly propaganda, is that's one issue. But I also think the structures of these things, that a lot of our pop culture is heavily militarized. It's not unique to the U.S., but it's absolutely been part of U.S. culture since Davy Crockett, right? And since the 19th century. And it is something I think that is more, it's more prevalent in, gunfighter culture is something that has been central to American culture, again, at least since the early 19th century, if not really before.
Do you have anything to add to that, David?
Well, as Dewar was speaking, I couldn't help but think the way in which, those iconic gangster movies, The Godfather Parts 1 and 2, of course, and Goodfellas became very popular, apparently, among gangsters. Because they started to behave more like the characters in those movies. And so, sometimes what is meant to be, a critique or an analysis, as it were, in a fictional way, of course, of a certain kind of lifestyle, turns out to be something that is in fact very appealing. And so, yeah.
So, to bring it back to, is this who we are, right? The theme of our teach-in here. American culture is a heavily violent culture from the moment Europeans first arrived, and for good or for bad, right? I actually teach a course called Violence in American History, right? And so maybe that's I leave the criticism or the praise to the interpreter, but absolutely our cultures and many of our subcultures have been suffused with violence, since Europeans first arrived. And so does that create an acceptance of violence as how I also teach US foreign policy, right? The acceptance of violence in the rest of the world. I think we need to take a comparative approach, right? What do other countries have? Do they all, have their heroes who are gangsters or who are gunfighters? But absolutely, this is who we are, right? And the people attacking the Capitol are drawing upon very deep and rich American history, right? They're not crazy in that sense. They think they are fulfilling their proper role in American society, right? Our founding fathers talked about nourishing the land with the blood of patriots, right? Like, this is what we're supposed to do. Thomas Jefferson told them this. Thomas Jefferson is the greatest, because everybody can embrace Thomas Jefferson and get pull a quote out of context and say, see, I'm the good guy. But the give me liberty or give me death, right? These phrases are central to our American identity. To the extent that we have a shared American identity, violence is something that we share. And we also have multiple subcultures that also pick and choose how violence fits within them.
Okay. Do we have any other questions at this time? Again, please feel free to use the raise hand feature if you want to talk directly, or write me or Ms. Cherry if you'd like to have us ask a question. We did have a comment that Tony Soprano as a hero prefigures the Donald. So I think that was going in and along with what you were saying, Thor.
Well, and also the bigger question of how we all construct our identities through pop culture, which is weird and strange, it's not unique to America. That's sort of the postmodern thing that does start. There's a great Buster Keaton film where he's watching the films while he's trying to woo the girl, since mass media does that for us. And so, right, gangsters learn how to be gangsters from watching. In the old days, it was from watching Cagney and Bogart, and then it's The Godfather, and to some extent we all do that. To circle back to David's point about we're all watching ourselves, right? And I think that may be where postmodernism begins, and the break between modernism and postmodernism is when we get so hyper self-conscious about this, and there's no escape from this loop, right? And and that's where, like David saying, I don't have a TV is the only way to escape, right? And partially, right? But then you're not plugged in, which is fine. But right, like if you completely, how do you go into the woods, right? Or something like that. But anyway, I think that's what makes the media environment so much more complex than simply dismantle the structures of propaganda. There's some of that, right? We need to hold Facebook and Twitter accountable. We used to have something called the fairness doctrine, regulating the airwaves. I don't know the solution. I'm not sure what do we do with, say, Fox News, right? Which has some news gathering, but they literally fired the people who called the election correctly, because the propaganda wing doesn't want that. That's not what brings ratings. And by the way, I'm not saying equally, but CNN may be more to blame for bringing Trump upon us than Fox News in their the amount of coverage and free media coverage they gave him in 2015 and 16, right? So how do we? And again, I'm not talking about censorship. I don't know. How do we get? The QAnon is, right? How do you get people out of conspiracy? I said at the beginning of my presentation, if you believe that there was widespread voter fraud that changed the election, that Biden did not beat Trump by 77 million votes, I don't know what to say to you, right? This is a challenge for me. I don't know how to help you if you're not willing or able. I tell my students, find a different media environment. You're in one that's misleading you. If they're telling you the earth is flat, if they're telling you that COVID is a hoax, if they're telling you that there's no such thing as climate change, if they're telling you that Donald Trump really won the election, all I can say is you need to go elsewhere. You're not being served by your media. Maybe they're exciting you and they're getting you riled up. That may be serving you. Maybe their commercials are better than some other stations and other things. Maybe their hair is blonder and their legs are longer. But other than that, they're not serving your awareness of the world around you. And I can't really, we can't be debating. We don't have a platform on which to debate policies. I love to argue with my students who disagree with me, and they sometimes win, and that's okay, even if they're wrong, they can still get an A, and we can learn from each other. I love that. But if you believe that, QAnon conspiracy theories, and I've had students send me these videos and say, like, I can't really engage with you. There's other people who can do that work for you to help you see through that. It's all out there. You have to find it. It's a challenge.
So our next question is, why has the left been unsuccessful in utilizing these methods of manipulation towards good in an effort to push their own agendas?
Well, I don't know if it's sort of a failure to come up with slogans, as it were, or just sort of nuggets of information. Very often there might be, let's say, a progressive candidate like Elizabeth Warren, right? And she may be making a lot of sense to an awful lot of people in terms of socioeconomic class relations and Wall Street versus Main Street, but she might be doing it in such a way that just doesn't quite fit into a soundbite. So I don't know if that's part of the problem of the left or progressives. You know, we know, for example, that, you know, according to surveys, polls, that, you know, most Americans believe in a lot of the things that progressives or the left talks about, and that wants to, let's say, make a more fair, equitable, and just society. There are a lot of programs, for example, that most Americans believe would be useful. But then, you know, very often they get sort of turned around, even to the sense that there was that sign that a anti-Obamacare protester was carrying, which read, Obama, keep your hands off of my Medicare, or something like that, Medicaid. And which was rather interesting because it is a social program. I think too, and there seems to be this disconnection between the way in which people, you know, again, back to the psychic truths, right? So my parents are what are called Reagan Democrats. That is, they used to be back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they used to be Democrats, Roosevelt Democrats. And then they got turned around with the culture wars and became more conservative and became Republicans. And my parents live, well, one of them still lives in Westfield, New Jersey. And Westfield, New Jersey is one of the most prominent, really, regions in New Jersey. And New Jersey is one of the most prominent, economically speaking, states in the United States. And my parents were able to live in a pretty nice 2-bedroom townhouse in Westfield on my father's pension. And my father was a cop for New York City for 30 years. And very good health benefits. My mother did not work, typical 50s, you know, mom. And so they were able to essentially live a pretty good life thanks to socialism, really. My father was paid by the state, and his union was very, very strong. But my parents, during their retirement, did nothing but bitch and moan unions, liberals, and progressives.
To jump in, you know, I think that's fascinating. And just my father lived into his 90s and became more liberal over the late years, much to my delight. And he didn't have Fox News, was, you know, maybe part of it, right? So I think I'm going to accept part of the premise of the question, right? I think the ways that people are appealed to on the right are different than on the left. And, you know, the outrage machine of Fox News and beyond, you know, and then the conspiracy theories of QAnon have, you know, the QAnon, I think, appeals to like some of my young, probably male students who are like, I'm seeing the truth. Right? That's what we want them to do in college is, look, I'm putting together all these different things that they're not telling you. That I was that kind of young guy. I'm still that guy, right? But then they grab onto something and they make a connection and all that. You know, I teach my students, don't trust authorities, but it doesn't mean you can just say, you know, the New York Times is a commie rag. Right? Because, and so there's a real challenge there. I also want to push back on the other side, like just about the Trump supporters. It's well documented that it's not economic anxiety driving Trump supporters. It's white people's cultural and potentially economic and political displacement, sense of displacement. Preliminary studies of those who attacked the Capitol, where they were older, male, mostly older, over 40, and mostly what we would call middle class, not working class, not lower middle class, professionals. Again, that's the first study I've seen come out looking at those who've been arrested, and of course it's incomplete, but that's interesting. I also want to push back on the whole premise. I'm going to reject it. Right, 7 million people voted more for Biden than for Trump. Never in my lifetime have I seen, since the 60s, since the Johnson administration, we've never had people with such, far liberal left wing, like Elizabeth Warren is a senator. She got elected. Bernie Sanders, these people not only have a voice in politics, they actually have some power. Doesn't mean they have maybe as much as they want or as I might want. We have a president who seems to have paid attention to the politics since Gingrich and actually learned some lessons, something that the Obama people didn't learn, or apparently they did and they just kept forgetting it, right? Which is politics is different since Gingrich. That is the narrow politics of what's happening on Capitol Hill. But people do, as David said, opinion polls show that people support broadly what we would call a liberal agenda, even people who identify as libertarian or climate change. It's had widespread support. We have a discourse around politics and public, our public airwaves, which distorts what maybe really is happening. But again, I want to emphasize the point that the left, and I would look at, like, I think in the 90s, The Simpsons was our greatest cultural center of discourse. And then in the early 2000s, we had people like The Daily Show and then The Colbert Show. And, that's a way that people on center left are being appealed to very successfully. I'm not sure what's going on right now in terms of, but I'm assuming they both, Colbert has a different platform, but it's, all of the late night comedians speak to, and SNL, I'm not saying that whether they're good or bad. I'm just saying they speak in a liberal vernacular that appeals to an audience. I'm not certain how much impact they really have, but we absolutely have liberal ideas in a public discourse. Again, more than I've ever seen. And as somebody, from that end of the spectrum, I've never been more optimistic. I'm not naive about the reality of politics, but optimistic is seeing people like Ocasio-Cortez have a real voice, right? Stacey Abrams have real voice and real access to power. And really being able to connect to people. I mean, I want to bring up gender here, right? Ocasio-Cortez, talked about her experience as a sexual assault survivor in a long Instagram. And this is something that, I think it's something that we talk about race and white supremacy, but, just speaking personally, every woman I know has experienced sexual harassment at a minimum, if not sexual assault, right? And I think that is something I haven't seen enough discourse around. That's part of what was so traumatizing about the Trump years and from the arrival of Trump. Not just white supremacy, but also a violent male culture, the violent possession of women's and girls' bodies that is also at the center of our political culture. I admire her for, and it takes it's a different kind of connecting to people. She's mastered Twitter, but she's also mastered a voice that connects to people. But she also, and I noticed this with obviously with Hillary Clinton, Nick, before Clinton ran for office, we'd been subjected to 25 years of propaganda about Hillary Clinton. I noticed it in myself. Like, I didn't really like Hillary Clinton, partly because some of her things I don't agree with. But I was like, wait, why do I have this distaste? And I sort of tracked through, since the first Bill Clinton sort of medical health insurance panel, she's been portrayed as this uppity broad. And you look at her resume, there may never have, I'm not saying she should be president or not, never been a person more qualified to be president in our history based upon her resume compared to the other candidate in 2016, right? But I knew people, I will never vote for that woman. And you can see it in the response to Ocasio-Cortez. There's a deep-rooted sexism in our political culture, not unique to the United States, not unique to us, but that is also being broken through little by little. You have fearless younger women who are insisting and not backing down from any fight. And that, that's a way to speak to people that the Republicans don't have. They are bringing more women in. It's sort of interesting. Two of their most famous right now are, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Liz Cheney, and the sort of extremes of the Republican coalition there. But it's not that Democrats can appeal to women and Republicans can't. Although there's some of that, but new ways of appealing to potential voters, right? That is that again gives me hope. I have a question came in to me, James. Can I bring
We
it
have
up?
a lot. When did it come in, Dwar? I have a whole bunch of questions. I try to go in order.
Oh, good. 135.
Okay, yeah, they're way behind.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right, Lucy has the next question.
So after the events at the Capitol, some media outlets have been documenting like public departures from the Republican Party, and also the statistics on how many people literally, went onto the voter registration websites and disassociated themselves with the party. And something that I'm asking maybe both of you a bit is what do you think? What are some of the implications of this? Do you think that like there's going to be like a different regard for facts, and there's like a new Republican, like is the Republican Party basically lost to these people who are not very committed to truth, or at least the representations of reality that like the liberal side of society has?
I've been listening to the stories of the demise of the Republican Party for demographic reasons for decades now. So I'm a little wary, but I feel like that is the case, right? And that's why I emphasize the structural, they are a minority party right now. It doesn't mean they can't change overnight and appeal to people. People love bipartisanship, or at least a lot of people. Most people don't pay much close attention to politics. They don't want to, right? And Trump sort of forced them to, and sort of make a stance, and some embraced that, and some said, no, I'm going to the other side, right? And some because they were motivated by Democrats. Most of my critique of Democrats all these years is that their main slogan seems to be, well, we're not as bad as the Republicans. And it's hard to motivate people to vote when that's all you got. This year, they really tried to, there's some of that, but they're trying to do more. So absolutely, but look, the Republicans are a minority party, so they can hold on to power by using the filibuster, using the gerrymandering, all of these things to keep in power. And I wouldn't rule that out. I wouldn't rule it out from working. My advice, that's why we need a new Voting Rights Act. That's why we need statehood for DC and Puerto Rico. That doesn't mean a permanent Democratic majority. What a political party in our system needs to do, because of the structure of our government, there can only really be two parties. That's a whole other argument, because it's a whole other thing. But we don't have a parliamentary system, so every other third party is irrelevant, except under the most rare extreme conditions. One of which might be Trump supporting his own party. But that, other than that, Republicans will have to figure out, how do we get some of those people back? Like if we really fully, and they will eventually, or they'll die. Some other party will emerge. Like our parties have evolved over time, and some have disappeared. So I do think that it's possible the party itself is not sustainable, and it'll fracture into two parties. And then each of those two parties will figure out, how can we pull away from some of the Democrats? And that's what the Republicans aren't, they're battling over that right now, but they don't really have to do it right urgently. As a minority party, they still have more power than their numbers indicate. That I don't think will be sustainable unless they continue to really rig the system, if you will. I hope that answers your question.
David?
Yeah, I was taking some notes with when the others were speaking, and as I was doing so, I suppose I was sort of jotting down things that might confirm what I was going to be presenting, right? So there were things like dual attitudes, and only 5% of us think in the rational mode of our brains. Then I think this Professor Wright, that there are threats that are being created and the role of the spectacle. So I guess it was maybe 2 or 3 days ago, I was reading something about, at least at that time, I think 85 people who had been arrested and participants in the January 6th riot, right? And while we're learning that about 25% of them had served in the military, there was also a large number of them who had become radicalized very recently. In fact, since the pandemic, because they've been at home and they've been spending a lot of time on the internet and on their phones, and they have gone down what I was calling that rabbit hole of a sort of virtual reality. And maybe some of it is, some of that virtual reality is, and the conspiracy theories, they're conspiracy theories based on threats. These sort of goofy things that I find rather astonishing that are online, but that people are sort of being drawn to. And I don't know, there wasn't necessarily a percentage of the number of people who have been arrested who recently have become radicalized, but it was pretty high. It was pretty high. So they're over a longer period of time, rather than that brief period of time that was mentioned in terms of the way in which we very spontaneously come to bad decisions. It's almost as if this new system, as it were, this, gosh, do I dare say it, this matrix that people are able to connect themselves into, are able to find that appear and appeal to what they think is their rational brain.
Thanks, David. Thanks also, Dua. This is 3 for 3, really excellent presentation. And I, for one, really, as far as I'm concerned, it's really doing a great deal to contextualize the events of January 6th and what that, what that portends, what it actually, a way of understanding it. So many thanks. I want to be really respectful of time. It's now 1:47, so I want to move into the next break. Our final panel begins at 2. We're going to go to a break, intermission. We'll start right around 1:59. Thanks.